we're going to talk about genealogical sources and why they are important. And we're going to start out pretty basic here. And the first principle here is that genealogy is the activity of searching, studying, and preserving your ancestry and family history. So sort of a generalized idea that genealogy is a specific activity that involves families and family histories. The other part of it that is probably not as easily understood is that genealogy is history. And this has not always been accepted a lot for many years, in going back a couple of hundred years. Genealogy was not considered to be history at all, but was considered to be something apart and something that only very important people, mainly royal families and people like that, were interested in or had any desire to even know or to preserve. The unfortunate part of that is that a lot of the genealogy in that time period started out as being totally fabricated, because the ruler, the new king, the new monarch or whatever that took over the country would then rewrite his or her own genealogy to, in a sense, validate their rule. So one of the byproducts of this is that from our perspective today, genealogy is something that you can do back to a certain period of time, and then you run into a lot of information that is or was at the time fabricated. And so we're talking about the time period before around 1550. 1500 would be the cutoff. The earliest verified genealogies, even in Europe or wherever in Europe, go only back to about 900 AD, and that's very few lines. They're called the Merovingian kings. In other countries of the world, there are genealogies and that are validly kept for back into into 300 or 400 BC. And those are in China and Japan and Korea and other countries where that was part of the fabric of their religion to preserve an accurate genealogy. But that's sort of understanding that genealogy is something that has to do with families is very important to a lot of people. And just a note here is, despite your own experience with a history class, history is not boring. It is alive, it is vibrant, it is full of all sorts of controversies and wars and all sorts of very emotional things. And can be extremely interesting. And it is something that all of us should be fully aware of. Genealogical research is finding, reviewing, and recording historical information about your relatives. And it's done from the records of their lives. And I guess one more word that I could have added in here is it's from the preserved records of their lives. In other words, we are heavily or completely rely upon the records that have been preserved. There's no other way to go back in time that has makes any meaningful, makes any sense at all, is other than work with the documents and the records that we have. Now we need to talk a little bit about the records themselves, so we'll understand some terminology. And here's the definition. Genealogically valuable records are those that were created at or near the time of an event by someone who witnessed the event or had a duty to record it. So those are the records that we're looking for. We're looking for contemporary or official records that record events in our ancestors' life and that were created at or near the time of the event. The closer to the time of the event, the greater the possibility that those records will be accurate. And the further removed they are from the event, the more possibility that they will not be accurate. So, for example, a record of a birth done at the time of the birth, such as a christening record, or near the time of the birth, such as a christening record, can be more accurate than the same record of a birth at the time of the person's death. So a death record that contains a birth date is less reliable than a birth record that was created closer to the date of the birth. And these are the kinds of things that you need to think about when you're looking at the record. And I'll go through quite a few of the steps of analyzing records that'll point out that fact. And most of the time spent during genealogical research involves finding the records. I think people today with family trees and fill in the name blanks have gotten to the point where they think that somehow or another genealogy is created by the family tree, that Family Search or Ancestry or MyHeritage or whoever is somehow creating these trees for us. The answer is no, that's not what's happening. We have people entering the information, and the only place that any kind of valid information could have been entered was from some record that already existed at as in existence, that could be used as a reference for that particular piece of information. Okay, so I just looked at, and I'm going to give this as an example. I looked at a person on the Family Search family tree whose name is William D. Teft, T-E-F-F-T, and he's marked senior. He has 56 sources attached, and I went through each of those 56 sources just a few minutes ago, and not one of them mentioned that he had a middle name. And as a matter of fact, during the time period involved, which is in the early 1700s, there was very uncommon for most people to have a middle name. That was not something that they used or did. And the senior designation was also absent for many of the records. So the D and the senior have probably been added by someone who either wished to clarify who the person was and thought that would help, but has nothing to do with the record of of the person so far that we found. If we found a record that said he was actually named William, Daniel Teft, then we would know the D stood for a name. But in this case, there doesn't seem to be anything. There may be more. I didn't change it. I haven't made the change yet until I make sure that I'm very secure that there is no record supporting that particular interpretation of his name. In the days of paper family group records, the way that would have worked is that William Teft would have appeared on a separate family group record, and there was, in that case, a great tendency when they were separate pieces of paper to add additional information which was not contained in any of the sources, because you had a William Teft 1, a William Teft 2, a William Teft 3, and there may have been a pile of William Tefts in your ancestry, and people did have the tendency to add information that was not in a record. So that's kind of one example of what we talk about. And the other part of this is the time spent searching for records. I think we're a little spoiled today because obviously you can click on any one of the major websites and get a lot of records. The problem is what happens when you run out of records that are on the major websites. And once you've run out of those records, what do? Well, most people are just stopped. And the idea here is that is where genealogy really begins, because you really need to start looking for additional records that may be in existence. There's no assumption here that any one or even all of the large online family tree database programs, Family Search, Ancestry, MyHeritage, Find My Past, on and on, in the list, actually have all the records. They don't. They have billions of records, but there are billions more. And those records are scattered all over the world. And that is the real, actually the real occupation, major part of the idea, the pursuit of genealogy. Okay. So since genealogical research always begins by searching for records, the important thing to understand is that it always begins by searching for records by the location of the events in our ancestors' lives. And the part of that that's important is almost all genealogically valuable records are stored and organized by the place where they're created. And the reason normally you would say, why would you read what was on the slide? And the answer is, I'm emphasizing the fact that these are basic rules, basic understandings of the functions of how genealogy and family history work. The concept here is you go out, you find a record, you look at the record, you evaluate the record, you extract the information from the record and record that information, and then record where you got the information. That's kind of the overall process that we'll go through today. So just to clarify, the terms record and document refer to the same things. It's a record, it's a document, it's a book, all those are all the same things. And we sometimes collectively refer to those as sources. And unfortunately, the word source, as used in the context of genealogy, has more than one meaning. So we're going to have to sort out a little bit of this terminology, and I will do that as I go along. Now, this is the next level. The citation is the formal written way of describing the source. So the record itself, for instance, a book, or any one of these items that are listed on the screenshot here that I have from Henry Martin Tanner, are considered to be sources. The way that information is recorded is the citation. So the citation is not the source, and the source is not the citation. The citation of the source tells you information about the source and hopefully tells you where to find the source. And the source is the record or document that the information came from. So those are the two, that's kind of the distinction there. And out there in the world, there are, in the academic world, there are multiple citation systems. There's quite a list of different ways that academic people and people who are involved in records and record keeping talk about their records. And these different citation systems are predominant in different areas of, for instance, if you're in social sciences, you use one. If you're in science, you use one. If you're a legal area, you use another citation. And here in genealogy, just for your information, we happen to use predominantly the Chicago Manual style, which is one type of citation system. Most of us never get to that level because we're filling in blanks on a website. And so when we're entering a name into Family Search or to Ancestry or even into one of the desktop programs like Roots Magic or Ancestral Quest, what we're doing is we're filling in a blank. It says name, and we fill in the information. That's creating a citation. And what they've done is simply give you a form that allows you to enter the information that it is part of this citation system. If you were citing this particular item, a book, in a different context, a paper or a book of your own or some other publication, you would be required to use whatever citation system was required in that context. If you were taking a class, an English class in a university, and you were asked to prepare a paper for a sort of a research project paper for that English class on some kind of writing, then any sources you would have to be cited, and the instructor, the professor, would probably say, we use MLA, Modern Language Association, or we use whatever different citation system there is out there. But the main idea here is to tell people where you got the information. So even though there's a formal way to do this, no one really is going to fault anyone for not following the formal system if they do actually end up telling everyone where they got the information. And the question is not, is it a certain citation system? The question is, does it contain enough information for subsequent researchers to find the document or record that was cited? That's the question. Okay, so we make progress in our research when we keep track of the records we find and where those records are located. So regardless of what you call it, you can call it a research log, you can put it on Family Search as a list of sources, you can do whatever you want. That once you find a piece of information that actually adds some point about a particular ancestor, then that piece of information becomes the source. Where that you got that becomes the source, and you need to tell basically where you got that information. Research logs are definitely important if you're doing research that extends well beyond any of the whatever you're putting into the Family Search family tree. If you intend to write a book about one of your ancestors or do your own history, you'll want to keep a research log. You'll want to make sure that the documents and records that you're talking about are available to someone somewhere, and that you can then use those or list those. So when we analyze those records, we form an opinion about our conclusions. All of our opinions about the record are subject to modification and further research and the research of others. It doesn't. There's a question that always arises about the Family Search family tree. Some people complain even today, after many years of the tree being online, that the big problem is that people make changes. Well, that's the nature of historical research. You're going to find a record that says something specific about an individual, and someone else will come and find a record and say, no, it didn't really happen that way, it happened differently. And that's the way that historical records evolve over time. And many times it'll even hit headlines in the news that someone discovered that there was a certain historical fact that no one knew about previously, and that just changes the way we look at whatever it is. And those things do happen, but they happen less and less frequently as people are very methodical in doing their research and exhaustive in the way that they carry out this. You can call your conclusion a fact. You can call your conclusion a proved fact. You can call it whatever you want to call it. But in essence, it's not a fact. It is a reflection of a historical source that whatever the historical source said is, you either can take it as correct or not. And whatever you say about it is your opinion. So it's not a little, it's a little disturbing to find out that history, unfortunately, is not as irrevocably fixed as some people would like it to be. History is more fluid and depends on a review and restructuring of whatever original conclusions were drawn from the record, and additional information that's obtained is drawn from the record. For example, I can give an example of a history of a small town in northern Arizona. Let's suppose that someone had written a history of a small town in northern Arizona in 1920, just a few years after some of those towns were settled. And there are many of those histories of those towns. The conclusions and the information that they based those books were based upon was nothing compared to the amount of information that we have today. And the conclusions that they drew about what happened and who was there and what they did is definitely subject to a lot of reevaluation. So this is something that to understand that this kind of is in the background of what happens with your historical research. So when does a document or record become a source? That's really simple. It's when you copy out the information and use it. If you copy out the information and use it, then that particular document becomes the source. That's where you got the information. And as I'll say later, and I'll reemphasize this later, what we're talking about sources, we're not just talking about printed material. We're not talking about books. We're talking about where you got the information. If you got it from your grandmother, that's the source. Put it down. Say, I got this from my grandmother. She told me the following. And she may be the most accurate source, the most accurate information that we're ever going to get. And in other cases, so oral histories are sources. And for people to start thinking, oh, well, that's not a source because that's not a source. But we will differentiate that. Records are categorized according to their possible validity. How valid is the record? How reliable is this record? And we generally divide them into what are called primary and secondary sources. A primary source is one that I mentioned earlier that's created at or near the time of an event. The closer to the time of the event, the more validity that particular record has. It's more likely that the people who were there know when the baby was born than there were people one or two generations down the line. And derivative information is created from the information in an original document, in a primary document. So indexes, all those kinds of things are derivative information. The fact that there's a listing, for instance, of all of the settlers of such a place that was done 50 years afterwards, that may be as accurate as it possibly could be. But on the other hand, where did that person get the information? If they were alive at the time and they're recording their memories, maybe their memories are correct and maybe they're not. But there's lots of different aspects to this. So when you're looking at entries in a family tree, for example, if you're looking at someone's pedigree and you're clicking through and you see all these names and they have zero sources and they have no reference at all to where this information came from, it's basically fantasy. It's imaginary. It could be copied from a valid source, but we have no way of knowing that. And there is no way in the world it's reliable. It's just simply not. And so as you go clicking back in one of the trees that you're looking at, say in Family Search Family Tree, which is, it's a unified tree, so it has a lot of information from a lot of other people. Whereas if you have your tree on Ancestry or MyHeritage, that's going to be all your information. And so you're not likely to disagree with your information. But if you go on the family tree, as you go back, you're getting information from a lot of other people. And it's very possible that your idea is different than theirs. But if they have no sources, if there are no sources listed, then it's up for grabs because no one has actually identified the information as correct. So that's where we stop. That's where that ends. That's where the end of the line ends, is when there's no more sources showing the information that's necessary. And the necessary piece of information is the parent-child relationship. If you show John Brown as the father of Henry Brown, then you have to have a record that shows that at some point in time, it was recorded that Henry was the son of John Brown. And if you don't, then even though you have John Brown as the parent, it is meaningless. It's fantasy. And if you try to copy another family tree just because it's there and there's nothing there, you're copying fantasy. It's duplicating something that is not real. It isn't. There isn't any way to know that it's real. How many times is it real? Let's say it's been passed down from your great-grandmother who did all this work on her line, but never bothered to tell us where she got all the information. If you go out and start verifying it, and you do find records that support that information, then you're starting to get into the world of having a source citation, of having a way to being able to verify if the information is correct. So why do we add source citations? What are the basic reasons for doing this? The first ones, they're necessary to establish the validity. In order for anybody to rely upon what you've written or put down there, it's absolutely necessary to have some contemporary historical source, or at least something that shows that there may have been an entry that said that. They provide information for where it can be found. I can go duplicate what you've done if you give me the source citations. If you don't give me the source citations, I have to redo all of the research on my own, based on my own ability to do that. And they indicate the status of the documentation for the individual and the family. So roughly speaking, for example, I have gone back through pedigrees within the last couple of weeks where I get to the point where somebody had like 30 or 40 sources attached. And that's great. That person's well documented. But there was nothing in all those 30 and 40 sources, as I've mentioned just a few minutes ago, that shows that there's a parent-child relationship. In other words, it doesn't tell who this person's parents are. And so anything beyond that is speculation. There's no way to know who, if the names that are actually sitting there in Family Search are the right people or not. You can give them the benefit of the doubt and say, oh, well, somebody knew this. Well, they may not. It may have been copied or just fabricated. That's the realization I had when I was very, very, very young in my genealogical research. I was at the Family History Library in Salt Lake, and I was copying pedigrees and family group records to try to figure out how much of the work in my family had been done at 25 cents a copy. They were fairly expensive items. And basically, as I found these, I found the records as I looked back on family group records and pedigrees, going back and back and back and back into time. And finally, I looked at it and I said, this can't be true. This cannot be correct. And of course, subsequently, after many, many, many years of doing the research, I've been able to basically say, now they're not correct, that there is no connection between this person and anyone who was in a royal family in Wales or in Ireland or wherever. They allow others to verify our entries and avoid duplication, which I've already mentioned. When you're building your family tree, consider the information about each person. And I love this on this cart here. Apparently it may be an out in front of a bookstore because it looks like somebody's out on the sidewalk here. It's think before you speak and read before you think. And I can only say that's tremendously important with genealogy, that you certainly read before you read what there is there, and think about it before you do anything to record it. So we're going to talk now a little bit about evaluation and how evaluation works into this kind of process. And it's a little more complicated, and be some more discussion. First of all, you're going to have to identify who gave the information, who's speaking here in this record. Who is it that made this record at the time? For example, if you were doing a parish register in one of the Catholic parish registers, or in one of the other churches with parish registers, then you would find the name of the person in the record who was the priest, who was the person who was there, and the most of the formulaic Catholic parish registers begin with the date, and then identify the name and location of the priest and the record, and then go on to tell what was being done, and then basically identifies the name of the infant being baptized, and the names of the parents, and in many cases the names of the godparents or witnesses. So all of this information is usually in a record, and if it's not in the record, then it makes it more and more difficult to evaluate where the record came from. For example, if you're looking at an index, maybe somebody made an index to a parish register and has listed a lot of the names with birth dates. Without the context of the original record, that index may be ambiguous. You may have people with the same name around the same period of time, and there will be no way to differentiate between each of those individuals. So knowing who the person was, not necessarily the name, but how this record came into existence, is one of the basic things for analyzing records. Did that person participate in or experience the event or events recorded? Okay, so was the person actually there, or are they writing about it at a later date? Is this an oral history of someone telling about their family from memory when they're 70 years old or 80 years old? Or is this a recorded event that was recorded at or near the time? That's the difference between let's say an oral history of someone taken when they're age 80, than that same person's journal record, which was maintained on a daily or weekly basis during their lifetime. So the validity of the day by day or week by week record would seem to be obviously more important and more valuable than than the remembered record at a much later date, particularly as to relationships, particularly as to dates, and particularly at a lot of cases as to locations of where the events occurred. So what's the time lapse between the event and the drafting of the record or document? So not only do we need to focus in on who created the document, but we need to think, how long was it after the event that this particular thing happened? Well, parish registers are another good example. When the parish priest, if the parish priest was diligent and was following the rules imposed by the Catholic Church in most locations around the world and in most of the Catholic Church records, then that person, that priest, would have recorded that record in a judicious fashion. In other words, within a day or two of the event when he had it, or he would have recorded it on the day of the event, and that would have been the proper procedure. But in occasionally, what we'll find in those circumstances is that the parish priest didn't do that. The parish priest was a circuit priest and went from church to church, maybe 2, 3, or even more churches, and he would collect he would do the baptisms, and then he'd come back to the main church and sit down, and either out of memory or out of a list that he made, a short little list on the side that he made, he would sit down and try and reconstruct all that. And then if you've ever been in that position of recording information that was supposed to be updated and recorded every day, you'll understand what I'm talking about, that the time lapse is what's important. Some of us, many of us, have to keep our hours as we did work. As a lawyer, as an attorney, I had to record practically every minute I breathed during the day in order to properly record what I'd done and what kinds of things. Because as we were required to record our time in order to bill. We had to bill on recorded time, and that was an order of the Supreme Court, Arizona Supreme Court. We couldn't just say, well, it was worth this much and charge it. We had to actually have a connection between the time. Well, that was probably the biggest challenge in our law firm, was getting all the attorneys to record their time. Some were very diligent, did it as they were working, and others tried to summarize it at the end of the day, and some just kind of threw it together at the end of the week. So it was, and in that case, we were certain that a lot of the time events were being lost. And from a law firm, the time was money, and that was a motivation to try to resolve that. The same thing applies to genealogical research, that if we find records, for instance, like I mentioned, a town history, if that town history had been printed for a town established, let's say, in 1780 in the eastern part of the United States, and the time record was being written in 1958, for example, that time lapse in there would indicate that in the absence of some source recording and some extensive documentation, that the information being provided was going to be what's called anecdotal, meaning it's simply a hearsay kind of information that is not reliable. It may be impossible to determine if the person who observed the event was the one who created the document. A lot of people rely on birth and death certificates. Now, these are rather recent documents that have only been recorded in the last few years, but a birth and death records are usually not recorded by the people who were observed the event. So basically, in the case of birth records, a birth record is created and then the doctor signs it, and they may or may not review it, and there may be errors made in the birth record. In addition to that, a death record, for example, relies on someone that they can get to give the information that's required for the form, not necessarily the person that was physically present when the person died, and add firsthand information. So understanding that gives us a little bit of latitude when we start saying, well, I've got the birth record and that's absolutely correct, and you don't have that and you're not correct. Well, we may find out that the information that was on the record was not recorded accurately. Was the person drafting the record or document in a position to know or judge the accuracy? This is another one. And so let's say there is a record that's recorded. One of the classic ones are pension records. When people were trying to, like Civil War and the other war pension records that are out there. Those records are accumulated and basically have testimony and affidavits and various things in them that can be very valuable, but they may actually contradict the information that historically is available. And that's an interesting situation. How consistent and believable are the records given the time and the place and the circumstances? That's one that goes to the question of whether or not these records could have been created at all at that time period. Were there records of people who actually could have existed at that time? In England, for example, the earliest parish register records date from 1538. If you have a birth record that is supposedly available from the 1400s, how do you evaluate that? And that's just, it may be accurate, but it may not even be a valid record at all. So one of the things we do need to do, and when we're working through and working with sources, is not name match. Just because we find Tom Jones in our record and we want to fill in a Tom Jones on our family tree, doesn't mean that the first record with Tom Jones that comes up is the one that we want. We don't just grab records by the name, or even by the name and the date, and even by the name and the date and the place in some areas of the world. So in order to, and emphasize this is the judgment, the rule of judgment of whether or not, for instance, in this screenshot, James Chattel is the father of Elizabeth Chattel, or that John Bryant is the father of Samuel Charles Bryant, revolves around the idea of whether or not there is a record which shows a parent-child relationship. Is there something out there, a church record, census record, any kind of record out there, occupational or land and property or probates, all the different lists of all the kinds of records, but does any of them show an actual parent-child relationship? Okay, so we get to that point, and if there's no more parent-child relationship records available, even though we know this person existed, we do not know that they are the parent of the child. So that's the end. That's the end of the line. That's where we stop. And as they say here on the front runner train, we don't go any further. When you're adding a source to the family search family tree, that's where you tell people where you got the information. I'm just going to go back a little minute here, and we're getting close to the end. So filling in this blank will give you a citation. So you don't need to worry about citation form and MLA and Turabian or Chicago manual style of anything of that nature, because you're going to be filling out this form. But when you fill out this form, make sure you're telling where you got the information. Okay, so let me give the classic. Many of the standard citation forms for books tell you the name, the author, the publisher, and the publication date. It does not tell you where to find the book. But line 2 here, line 3 down from the source title, but entry level is where the record is found. That does not mean, that means you need, where did you get the book? Did you get it online? Did you get it in a library? Did you have it in your own possession? But we want to know where the book can be found. And we have marvelous tools today to find out where books can be found. And there's no reason why we can't tell people where we got the record. The simplest way today, for example, if you pick up a record online, is you put in the URL, and that's a link to the record. It should be a link to the record itself, or at least to the place where the record was found. And this also would tell us, if we know where the record was found, it'll tell you all sorts of information. And what they've got here on the form is helpful in suggesting some of the responses that may be important to that. So emphasize again that personal oral histories and any kind of personal knowledge and letters and everything that you would think of are valid. They're valid sources. They're important sources. They're tremendously important sources. In fact, sometimes more important than any of the other records that we can find. The fact that a person was born and married and died is not nearly as important to find out that they also had an oral history, or that they had that there was a series of letters that they wrote, because these things open up the reality of the family rather than just the bare bones structure that goes back in time. And that extends our understanding of not only the history and the context, but makes any step we take further back to be more valid. It's very less likely for you to accept that someone is the parent of a child if you know enough about the child to know that that person is not even logically the parent. So for example, if you have done all the research and you find out that your ancestor individual was born and married and died in a small town in England, and that you find all other records which indicate that they were in that small town, and then you find that someone says, well, this is the father and he's lived here. And the answer is no, because your person was never there. He never was in that location. He could not have been that person. And that's the kind of analysis. And you just, that's the kind of thing that just is there that you need to be aware of every time you look at a various record. Does this record making any sense? Okay, when is it not a source? So this is the things that I've absolutely pointing out. They're not sources. User-created entries in a family tree that don't identify where the information was obtained. So I don't care who it came from. Initially and very early in the years that I began to do research, obtained a vast pile of files from my great-grandmother, who had died before when I was very young, and whom I did not know. And there was tons of information in there, and I have spent virtually the rest of my life verifying and correcting the information that I received initially. And some of the information I received from her is not valid. It has no parent-child relationship sources listed, and we can't verify that the information that she recorded is correct. her information includes letters and correspondence and talking to actual people. But once she goes back past anybody that she could have talked to personally, then it becomes very difficult. What we call old GEDCOM files. If you have an old disk that you've inherited from one of your ancestors, one of your relatives, and it has a file on it that looks like it came from personal ancestral file, it's probably a GEDCOM file because that was the file that was used to store information back then, and it's currently being used, by the way, and is being updated. And there'll be more about that at RootsTech, as a matter of fact. If you're interested, that you can tune into RootsTech and learn more about GEDCOM. Be a couple of videos. They might be a little bit hard to find with all of the other videos out there. Anyway, the information there is no more valid than anything else, unless it has the source attached. And my experience is that if it does, there's usually only one source, and that source may or may not be accurate and may not apply to that particular individual. So you just need to be very careful with these. Any big pile of old family group sheets and pedigrees that you have that don't have any source notations on them. I have seen both family group records and pedigrees using the back of the family group record to type in exhaustive lists of sources that were used in compiling the record. And those are the exception rather than the rule, because all the ones that I see are totally without any kind of source citation. And the information is helpful in the sense that it gives us a starting place, but it's certainly not conclusive as to whether or not this particular relationships and people existed. Any documents or record that is a copy of another document or record without source information. So you understand the copying process itself is a kind of destructive of information. So the more copies it is from the original is what's important. Okay, so carefully consider the information about each person before adding it as a source. So look at this, see if this sounds like it's correct, or if it's information that could be, may not be correctly. So be careful and a little bit critical of any of these green leaves. This is the new design from Ancestry. If you haven't seen it, this is the latest Ancestry family tree. They did actually change it after longer than I can remember. And so there are still the sources and that information. So, but when you look at those record hints, those are hints. They're not absolutes, and just make sure that they're consistent and that they're actually talking about the person that you're using. And look out for any entries that don't have any sources. How do you know that person actually is part of the family? How do you know that there was a child at that age? Maybe the name was just plugged in in a gap in the birth. So lastly, what is a duplicate and what is not a duplicate source? There's a lot of people that have a tendency to look at long lists of sources on the family search family tree, for example, and decide to go tidy up the sources, meaning they think that anything that looks like it's the same should be eliminated. So the question here is, we have a Thomas Parkinson Mormon migration data in the Mormon migration database of 1840 to 32, and we have it from a world source, because the little world out there at the end by the date. And then we have it a family tree source, meaning it came from Family Search. That's the Family Search logo. So are these the same one? And the answer is yes, they are. They're the same database. Is there a reason for deleting one of them simply to save space? No, you're not saving any space. The amount of energy and the number of pixels that it takes to to record this is just entirely insignificant. And it's not going to clutter up anything. There's no clutter here. It's just simply another copy. But the answer is different because these came from different people. And so each of these people may have had a different reason for attaching this source when it was. And you'll see they were attached at different dates. So maybe there was additional information at a later time, and it's important to keep both. So it's not something you just automatically decide, well, I'm going to tidy this up and take this out because I don't like the long list. Well, the long list is what validates the whole thing. And without that, you've got nothing. Down here, the answer is you have two 1860 censuses. Are they the same? The answer is no, they are not. One of them comes from a different source. They both come from different sources from where the records were obtained. You'll say, well, they're the same census record. That's a little bit naive because they're not the same census record if they came from Ancestry and Family Search. Both of those records have been enhanced, let's say. And if you want to look and go find the original records, they are online and available. A set of the original census records are on a website called archive.org. And when you go back and look at the original records, there's a lot more notations and there is a lot more information there than is on the federal census records today. And so it's nice to have extra records in case one of these different places stops providing records. And so that's not a duplicate source. Okay, just make sure they contain the same information and came from the same place. And still, what if they're submitted by two different people and there's two different reasons for submitting them? Okay, well, thanks for watching.